Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. I want to talk this afternoon about the Kamma of thought. First of all, to get a little bit of clarity around what Kamma is and how it works, Kamma or karma is action. It's volitional action, things that are done with the body, speech, or mind. And any karmically effective action will have a resultant, karma resultant, vipaka. So our experiences in life are in part the result of past karma. Past karma is always one of the causal factors. It's never the only causal factor for our experience. There are natural factors, there's laws of physics, there's laws of genetics, and so on. These are the different niyamas. But karma is always one that is one of the factors that applies whenever we have an experience through the senses. And we say that karma is done with body, speech, and mind, but that's only a kind of a crude approximation. Karma is actually done only in the mind. An action that has no mental impulse behind it doesn't have any karmic weight. The classic example is stepping on a beetle in the dark. If you deliberately stomp a beetle, then that's an act of killing, breaking of first precept, and it has a karmic weight attached to it. But if you're walking in the dark and you don't see the beetle and you step on it, you're not making any karma with that. The result for the beetle is the same either way. Doesn't make any difference to him, but for the actor, the doer, it makes a difference. This was actually one of the differences between Buddhism and Jainism. The Jains believe that karma is made by the body also, so that stepping on a beetle in the dark is also karmically heavy. And so Jain monks will take elaborate procedures not to kill small creatures. For example, constantly sweeping the path they're walking on to make sure that there's no bugs or ants on it. Whereas in Buddhism, it's only deliberate actions that have any karmic weight. So karma always originates in the mind. And in terms of the Abhidhamma theory of mind moments, is one way to look at karma at a very fine grain, we could say, at a very microscopic level, is a balancing of the ledgers of the mind. That for every skillful mind moment, you'll have a pleasant resultant, and for every unskillful, you'll have an unpleasant mind moment resultant. So karma always originates in the first instance in thought, in the mind. Something done accidentally, unknowingly, is not considered karmic. So this brings us to the question of when the action is done only at the level of the mind, with thought only. There is a karma attached to thought. This in the Buddha's Eightfold Noble Path. The second path factor is sammasankappa, right thought or right intention. And that's defined as thoughts that are not greedy, not cruel, and not deluded. It's given in negatives. Ahimsa, alobha, adosa, amoha. So it's refraining from thought forms that are, based on defilement. This is in itself kind of indicative of a deeper teaching that in many cases we find, particularly in points like this, pointing to morality, ethics, is that the expressions are given in the negative. It could be phrased in positive terms. It could have said instead, right thought is thoughts based on generosity, on kindness, and so on. But it's given in those negative forms, which implies that the more natural expression of the mind is the wholesome one. That when the unwholesome thoughts are not present, the mind will naturally go to loving kindness and generosity and wisdom and peacefulness. And this is something I think we find throughout the Buddhist teaching, that the general thrust of it is that progress is made not by gaining new virtues, but by abandoning or liberating oneself from various defilements and fetters and allowing the more natural, primordial purity of the mind to express itself. The mind will naturally go to loving kindness when thoughts of ill will are not present. Mind will naturally go to kindness and generosity when thoughts of greediness and selfishness are not present. So in a way you could say it takes more mental energy to hold defilements in the mind than not. The path factor of right effort, which is number 6, is defined in terms of the 4 right efforts, which all have to do with the contents of the mind, or thought defined broadly. The effort to rouse up wholesome states that have not yet arisen, the effort to encourage and cultivate those wholesome states that are present, the effort to not allow unwholesome states to arise, and the effort to diminish those unwholesome states that have arisen. Those are the right efforts. This effort applied to the contents of the mind. Now, when we get to considering the nature of thought itself, you see that thought has a volitional component, but it's not ordinarily controlled without some effort, which anyone notices when they begin meditating. The mind is all over the place, and we talk about the monkey mind jumping from branch to branch, and it seems like it's out of any possible control. It's just an anarchic kind of wandering, throwing up this and that, and even with an effort to rein it in, it doesn't seem easy to do. Well, it's important to understand, the role of volition in the process. For one who is not the only one who has full control of the mind is an arahant. So one of the definitions of an arahant is he is master of the pathways of his mind. He only thinks that which he wishes to think. He does not think what he doesn't wish to think. So he's completely in control of his own mind. For all of us who are not at that stage, then there's different degrees of control of the mind, and at different times. When you're bright and sharp and clear, you'll have better control of your mind than when you're dull and half awake. But there's always, in each mind moment, there's an element of volition. This is another teaching from Abhidhamma, that volition is a universal factor that's arising in each mind moment. And this is a tricky kind of a subtlety to understand volition, or cetana in Pali. It's called cetana, is the mental factor of volition, or will, we could say. In Western philosophy, there's a long-standing issue of free will versus determinism. And this is a major problem in philosophy in the West. And this comes up often when speaking about the mind and thought. In Buddhist terms, people wonder about free will and determinism, which is a kind of a false category to apply, because the Buddhist understanding of the psyche is without a self. Free will and determinism comes in when you have a concept of a discrete self, and an Atman, or a soul, or an ego, however you want to call it, as a real substantial thing. And then the question is this thing determined or is it free? But in psychology based on no self, there's only a dynamic interplay of factors. There's no substantial entity continuing from moment to moment. So Chaitanya is just one of a complex of factors. One of the factors is will. And it too is part of the conditioned realm. So it has causes and conditions. It's part of the dependent origination as well. And I think one of the problems when we try and think about this and make sense of it, one of the things we should try and avoid is a linear kind of concept of process. Remember, there's a couple of axioms that are a basis of the Abhidhamma. One is that nothing arises without a cause, and the other is nothing arises from a single cause. So when we talk about dependent origination, for example, it's in essence really a simplification. It's a schema to explain how things arise in the human experience. But each moment is part of a three-dimensional net or web of causes. That everything which arises has multiple causes. And volition is just one vector, driving the mind moment. So there's an element of cetana, or volition, or will, however you want to call it, present in each moment of thought. But it can be very slight. And this means it also has a very little karmic weight. At other times there might be stronger volition. You might be deliberately choosing to think about something. This, for example, when you're trying to solve a problem, you're trying to figure something out. Why won't the generator start? You put your mind to figuring out the carburetor and gas filter, and you're deliberately thinking. You're putting your mind onto a problem. So there's a deliberation involved. So there's a heavier degree of cetana, or will. And this requires some effort. So if you don't put an effort in, the mind will just run on habitual patterns. And the influence of will or cetana is very slight, and the influence of past karma is very strong when the mind runs on a habituated path. And to break out of habituated path, then that requires effort and a stronger application of cetana. So this is where a right effort comes in. If you notice that your mind has caught in unskillful patterns, habitual patterns, maybe grumbling mind, or anxious, nervous mind, or greedy, wanting mind, and you find this like a pattern that you fall into easily and is habituated, then there's actually very little will involved in going with that, and there's very little karma being made. It's negative, but it's small. But then it requires an effort of will to change that, and it is possible to break out of that. One of the ways the Buddha talks about is substituting a skillful thought for an unskillful thought. And the examples probably talked about most is overcoming thoughts of ill will with thoughts of loving kindness or compassion. So that if you find yourself being negative or angry, hostile in your thoughts towards an individual, you try and send them loving kindness. And try and think of something positive about that person to bring to mind. The Visuddhimagga talks about this at some length as giving different kind of examples. And it says, if one thing, if all else fails, you can't think of anything good to think about the person, then imagine them when they were a little baby. But usually even the worst kind of people have some good side. Like to say, like Hitler loved his dog. So there's always some point you can find to focus on the positive. And that's applying right effort, and that's working skillfully and wisely with the karma of thought. One thing that's an important caution is when we talk about the karma of thought, not to fall into feeling guilty because you had unskillful thoughts. I mean, that's just compounding the problem. Everybody is, unless you're an arahant, everybody is, human beings will have skillful and unskillful thoughts arising all the time. And it's completely counterproductive to let yourself feel negative about yourself because you've had unskillful thoughts. You've been thinking ill will of your neighbor, then to start punishing yourself for it. That's counterproductive. It's silly. It's no point in going there. So you don't have to try and you don't make yourself neurotic by trying to be a policeman of your thoughts. Don't suppress thought. Like if you just pushing it under the carpet, it's not of any benefit. So recognize, understand and this is where awareness, sati, mindfulness comes in, is be present, aware, know your own thoughts. Acknowledge them, be aware of them, but don't validate them, believe in them, or identify with them. This is quite important too in understanding the nature of the thought process. It is like all phenomena in conditioned world. It's dependently arisen. It's essentially empty. and it's impermanent. People can actually suffer a great deal with their thoughts. People can even suffer to the point of suicide based on thoughts, on ideation. And there's no reason to do that. If you understand the nature of thought, it's empty, it's dependently arisen, there's really nothing there. Even if it's based as a reflection or a mirror of some external object or situation, it's still just a thought. It's a thought formation, and it has no actual substance. Thoughts might be of the past, we call them memories, or they might be of the future, speculation or fear, hopes, or they might relate to the present moment. Thoughts of the past are unreal because they are referencing events that have passed away and are no longer existent. Thoughts of the future are unreal because they're referencing events that have not yet manifested, so they have no substance. Thoughts of the present are unreal because you can't pin them down. As soon as you look at it, it's already in the past. The present moment is always fleeting away. So all the thoughts are essentially unreal. It's also useful to understand the limitations of thought. I would say that the power of thought and the limitation of thought. Power of thought is what enables us to live in the world. We need to have the ability to organize experience, to be able to effectively do anything, to accomplish anything. And, without thought, nothing is done or accomplished. Anything that we make or do or build, it begins with a thought. First there's a thought in the mind, and then the body follows along and does it. It always originates with thought. And obviously anything you try and accomplish, if you have a greater ability to organize your thinking, the task is going to be accomplished more efficiently and better, with better results. So thinking has a very important practical function. The limitation of thinking could be expressed in a couple of different ways. One is the danger of taking it too seriously, that what we think is not necessarily in accord with reality. There are many ways in which thinking can be wrong. You could start out with a wrong premise to begin with, and then anything you build on that's going to be wrong, not in accord with reality. Or you could just make false reasoning and assumptions along the way. I think we have to particularly watch out for the tendency of the mind to use thought to validate an opinion or a decision that comes about intuitively or emotionally. Thought, reason can function very much like a lawyer. It can argue either side of the case. And you can have a decision made on an entirely emotional basis, and then you justify it by constructing arguments in your mind, and then tell yourself that this is the most logical thing to do. And it's easy to fool yourself in this way. need to be clear about about the underlying roots of our decisions and our impulses. The other limit, and these are problems that can be overcome and worked with, but the other limitation of thought is something that will never be accomplished by thought, is a realization of the unconditioned. The mind is capable of clearing away escaping from the conditioned and then experiencing the unconditioned, but it's not capable of understanding or comprehending the unconditioned in the way we understand or comprehend conditioned things. And this is not because of a limitation of thought. It's because of the nature of the unconditioned itself is beyond conditionality. That means it's beyond any kind of syllogism or comparison or anything that's available as a tool to thought is not, even at the highest, the most refined, the most genius level thinking cannot comprehend or hold the unconditioned, because the unconditioned is in a realm totally outside of anything thought can accomplish. So you can't think yourself into liberation, and you can't really think about nibbana, even though as many books and many pages have been written about nibbana or nirvana in Sanskrit. In a way, it's all a dance around about. It's not striking at the essence, which is ineffable, meaning it's undescribable. It can't be put into words because words are limited conditionality. It's like thought ceases at the thought can't cross that threshold. So one of the ways we get closer to that is in meditation, when we get behind or beyond thought, then we're experiencing the mind in a more natural state. And the mind isn't doing thought. That doesn't mean that, as some people think, meditation means you suppressing your thought. That's not really correct. If you're meditating well, your thought will become quiescent. It'll become quieter, and there'll be less of it. And eventually, in second jhana, there is no thinking process. But in the meditation for a long time, there will be thinking arising, passing away. And the effort as such should be, to be clear and that the thought is clearly seen, but also to try and notice what's beyond, behind, or between the thoughts. Notice the quiescent space in between thoughts. There might not be much of that initially. The mind is just constantly chattering away, but then with practice the mind becomes quieter, and you notice periods when there's no thought, and there's just mind, being mind. The presence of consciousness is there, but there's no thinking. And that can give you a glimpse into a deeper state of being, something underlying the thought process. And if you can notice thoughts rising and falling, I'm speaking primarily about Vipassana meditation. When you're noticing thoughts rising and falling, you see their impermanent nature, Now that in itself takes away the strength of the thoughts, and they become more quiet. And it is possible to get to the mind to a place where you're noticing the intention to think before the thought arises. And this is when you really can understand what we're talking about with the cetana, the will to think. That the mind can be so quiet that you can just feel the first disturbance of an intention to think, and as yet there's no content. You're not thinking about anything, but you can feel the mind sort of gathering, ready to think. And then if you notice that clearly, consciousness is applied to it as an object at that stage, it can stop. You can just stop it. You just abort the process before it comes into full manifestation. And the mind continues quietly, quiescent, with only this occasional little burble. Yeah. Then you see that the intention to think is a factor separate from the actual thought itself. This precedes the thought. First there's a movement, a gathering, and then the intention is fed into it further. It'll gel into a proper thought. You'll be thinking about something. And thought has a linear nature. It then becomes a conditioning factor of its own, impelling further thoughts. And this is when you get caught in a train of thought. You get lost in a speculation or a daydream or some kind of wandering of the mind. It's that one mind moment is feeding the next. All of the path factors, the 8 path factors, they exist on a mundane and a supramundane level. When we talk about the Eightfold Path, we're usually talking about the mundane level, which is what guides us as we make our way through the conditioned world. But there's another aspect to the Eightfold Path, is when they come together fully perfect, which is what samma actually means. The 8 path factors are samma, sankappa, and so on. It's usually translated like right view, right thought, right speech, but it's more literally perfect. And when they become perfect at the and all of them 8 are perfect together, this is a path moment. This is the moment of Magga in Maggaphala. And this is the emergence into awakening. And this is always given in the Abhidhamma when it's explicated. The mind moments leading up to full awakening is at the very penultimate moment is Magga, and then Phala is the fruit, is the realization of Nibbana. So it's Maggaphala. This is another Pali term that indicates what in English is usually called enlightenment. It's the realization of Maggaphala, and it's given as a 2-step. There's 2 mind moments. There's the moment of the path, which is a karmically effective moment, and then the fruit, which is karmically resultant, an immediate result. So the path factors, when they reach this transcendental or supramundane level, at path moment, they're all aligned to Nibbana, to the unconditioned. So right thought is entirely aligned to the unconditioned. So it basically immolates itself. It's like throwing itself into the abyss. Because a thought about Nibbana is, in the end, is a kind of paradox. It can't be held by thought. So thought abandons itself, voids itself into Nibbana. So I think I'll stop there.
Kantamayam Dhamma Kataya Sadhu Kalam Dharamase